let's start taking all these ideas of EQ and compression and applying them to something a little more complicated, like a drum set. This is one of the drum recordings off of Bone Guns' Annex record. This is the track Sasquatch Hopscotch, and these are the raw drum tracks. I've got them loaded into, this is Harrison Mixbus 32C. I think this is personally the DAW I like using to mix if I'm mixing my own projects nowadays. The workflow just works for me. All these techniques are applicable in any DAW. It doesn't really matter. I just like using this one for mixing. So as you can see, we just loaded in the drum tracks. When I tracked these drums with Charlie, and we tracked them as a band, we did the live off the floor technique, which is the whole band played together and the drummer was playing to a click track, and we just did a bunch of takes, and then I later edited together the different sections. So we'd say like, hey, this was the best take for the verse, this was the best take for the chorus, and comp them together. And we did that so the drums had that kind of energy of live off the floor, but it was still really tight to the grid. And then I went through and re-recorded the guitars and all of that later. But these are just the raw drum tracks. And when we recorded this, we weren't entirely sure what the album was going to be. So I didn't do any processing to tape. So I just did mic, preamp, DAW. It's straight into the A to D converters. I didn't do any EQ and compression. Normally, if you have the gear available, it's good to do a little bit going to tape if you have a vision for where the album's going, or under any sort of time crunch, because it sounds more like a record from the get-go and everybody gets more excited working on it, and you don't have as much work later down the line because it already sounds like a record. So a lot of the times when you get raw drum tracks from people, they have had some EQ and compression already put on them. So that's something to keep in mind versus these drums. I know factually there was no EQ and compression put on because I didn't do it. I tracked the drums, I didn't do it. But usually when I get tracks from other engineers and even sessions I do myself, there will be EQ and compression on the drums already. So it's important to not get in the mindset of you have to do something just because. Listen to it first and go, does this need something? If so, what? Don't sit there and go, oh, I have to slam all this EQ and compression on there because that's what I always do. That's a very quick way to make all the stuff you work on kind of sound exactly the same. And there's some people that made a career out of doing that, but to me, it kind of kills some of the fun out of it. But I have the luxury of working on my own projects and I'm not under time crunches, so I can be a little more open-ended. Anyways, let's dig in. First thing I always do whenever I get anything to mix is I will go through and organize the session in an order that makes sense to me. Since we're just looking at drums, I organize the drums and I do kick, front of kick, snare top, snare bottom, rack tom top, rack bottom, floor top, floor bottom. So what that means is there's a microphone on top of the drum and a microphone underneath when you're saying top and bottom. So for all of these drums, the snare, the rack tom, and the floor tom, I had two mics on them. Then the overhead left and right, and then a hi-hat mic. And that's all we did for these drums. So kind of a mix between, I was trying to keep it as little as possible for the kind of bigger rock sound we were going for. And then once I've organized the tracks in an order, then I'll go through, if it's a song with any sort of song structure or changes up, I'll go through and label where the changes are so I can keep things organized in the song. So you can see I've got start, verse 1, chorus 1, bridge, chorus 2, and then the end section. And it makes it quick, so while we're working, it's easy to hear what we're doing on the different sections and reference them instead of always having to figure out where you're rewinding. Spending that 3 minutes setting up your session like this will save you hours down the line because everything's just going to be organized from the get-go. And in the situation where you're having to work with other people, it makes it easier to work with them because everything's nice and labeled. Or if I've had this happen too, where I'll work on a session and then for whatever reason it kind of gets shelved, or years later I want to go in to tweak something or whatever. If it's not labeled and organized, it makes your life a living hell. Versus get in the habit of labeling and organizing everything, your life is going to be so much easier. So anyways, rant on that over. Let's dig in. First things we do is let's just listen to the drums raw. So we'll start at verse 1 because there's not much in the start of this song. So as you can see, I'm not doing anything yet. And with Mix Bus, here's all the EQs, and I can set the sends up however I want. Nothing's happening. And all the faders are at 0. So the first thing I do whenever I'm mixing anything is I kind of get a base level volume setting. And I do that with the trim knob if your DAW has a trim knob, or a trim plugin if you're in something like Pro Tools that doesn't have a trim built into the mixer. And the reason I do that is I like to keep 0 on the fader as kind of my reference point for home base for the mix. And that way, if I've set everything up so it kind of sounds like a mix with just the trims, then I know that 0 on the fader is a good starting place for when I'm doing automation and everything. And we can see with the way it is right now, it's hitting my limiter on the 2-bus. And I don't want to be hitting the limiter this early. So I'm going to actually go through and just turn down the trim on everything by 4 dB, just so we have some headroom and we're not hitting that limiter. So that's the first thing I'm doing. I'm just turning everything down by 4 dB, and that way we don't kill our 2-bus. And you'll hear some people talk about that gain staging isn't as important nowadays, as long as you're staying inside the computer and you're not dealing with summing amps or mixing on an analog console or anything like that. And technically, for some DAWs, they are correct that the DAW, you're not going to clip the summing engine anymore, so you don't have to worry about headroom as much. But there are plugins that do clip, and there are plugins that have saturation built in, so basically distortion. And if you run into those plugins with too high of a signal, you are going to clip that plugin or drive the saturation a lot, and sometimes you'll do it without even realizing it. So I personally like to still think of gain structure while I'm working and keep it lower, like as if I was working on an analog console. Then I never have to worry about accidentally clipping something or oversaturating with a plugin. I can just use any plugin I feel like, and I just don't have to worry about it. And the other advantage of doing it that way is I always have room to turn things up when I need to because there's plenty of headroom. Now, just to keep a refresher, headroom is the difference between what's going on in your audio and the point of clipping. So you have clipping up here where that's as loud as digital can get, and you have where your audio usually is, and the difference between those two is your headroom. So it's easy for a mastering engineer to turn it up. But if you clip and you give them a clipped file, they can't get rid of that clipping very easily. So make their lives easier, give them a file with some headroom in it. So we turned everything down by 4 dB, and let's watch our limiter, see if we're hitting it at all. Okay, we're good. So the next thing I do is I listen to this and go, what is too loud? Is there a specific drum that's too loud? Is there anything that's just throwing the mix off? So let's just listen to that, and we'll go to the chorus because he hits the toms really hard here. So to me, I'm hearing the bottom mics sound louder, and I know the sound of bottom mics, so I can solo them so you can hear what I'm talking about. Here's the bottom mic here. You hear how that boom, boom, that's the bottom mic sound. So I'm going to turn down these bottom mics by a bit. I'll turn it down, 2 dB. So now that's down to 6. And I'm going to turn this floor tom down to 6. And this top mic on the floor tom, listen to this sound. It's that initial thud on the floor tom. So here's the floor tom with top and bottom. I'm not hearing a lot of that initial thud. So I'm going to turn up its trim by 2 dB. And you hear how we're getting some of that initial attack and the ring. So that sounds closer to a mix. Okay, that's cool. Let's go back to the verse groove and listen to it now. So the hi-hat mic, to me, feels a little loud, so I'm going to turn that down just a bit. And that ring on the rack tom was still a little loud, so I'm turning down the bottom mic. And the attack on the rack tom was a little quiet, so I'm turning up the top mic. Okay, so we're going to say reasonably whatever. The trims are set reasonably well right now. And, and caveat on all this, I'm on headphones, so on speakers, I might hear problems totally different. And I think it's dangerous to mix just on headphones, but we'll get into why on all that later. We've got a basic trim setup. That's the first thing I always do. The next thing I do is I set the overheads, and depending on how the drums were mic'd, you set the overheads differently, but usually it's hard left and right, and you go like hard left right, and you don't, and most people that mic'd up the drum set label the overheads that way. And if there was some artistic decision like, hey, we want mono overheads, they'll usually tell you. Usually, if it's labeled overhead left, overhead right, you're going to pan it hard left and right. Now, the trick when you're recording drums with overheads, with stereo placement, is first ask your drummer, do you want it to sound, when you're listening to it, that the hi-hat is on the left side, so like a drummer would play it, so it sounds like they're sitting in front of the drum set. So you have hi-hat on the left, the floor tom and stuff on the right if they're a right-handed drummer, or vice versa? Or do you want it audience perspective, as if the hi-hat is on the right and the floor tom's on the left? So some drummers really do care about this, so always ask the drummer, because they're the ones that are going to be listening to your drum mix the closest. So if you pan all the drums from the opposite perspective of what they want, it's always going to sound wrong to them, and you're just going to be fighting yourself the whole time. So I always ask the drummer, do you want an audience perspective or drummer's perspective? And I don't think there's necessarily a right or a wrong on it. It's usually drummer perspective. You're going to be safer because drummers are the ones listening to that and they're the ones that really care. So usually if the drummer doesn't know or care, just do it drummer perspective. So the hi-hat on the left and the toms on the right, if they're a right-handed drummer. I think for most drummers are going to be happier that way. That all said, for this project, we actually went the opposite. We went audience perspective, hi-hat on the right, floor toms on the left, because we wanted it to feel like we were watching the drummer, but it was a conscious choice. So what you do is we hard pan the drums, hard left and right, and we listen to it. And you listen for where things are placed in the stereo image with the panning of the overheads. And you try to pan your close mics to match with the overheads. Because if you pan your close mics to match with the overheads, you're going to have less likely of phase cancellations and stuff. Because if my overhead's saying the hi-hat is over here, but I pan the hi-hat over here, that means I'm going to get weird phase things versus if I put the hi-hat where the overhead says it should be. So I always set my overheads and then pan the close mics as close as I can get them to where it sounds like with those overheads. So let's listen to the overheads and listen to the hi-hat. And you can hear how the hi-hat with these overheads, it sounds like it's coming over from the right speaker. So, I'm flipped obviously, but it sounds like it's coming from the right speaker. So what you do is you solo the overheads with the hi-hat mic, and we'll do it wrong first. I'll put it hard left and you can hear this. You hear how it makes it so the hi-hat seems all washy? If I have the hi-hat panned in the wrong side. Versus if I set that hi-hat, it sounds to me like it's coming, mostly on the right side, but not far right. So we'll do it, 40 to the right. And this is the danger of headphones. It's hard to tell exactly where things go, but in my headphones right now, this seems pretty close. And I'm sure everybody is laughing at me for saying that because it sounds totally different on speakers. But the idea is you can hear how it sounds a lot around that 30 mark when we pop that close mic in. Hear how it makes it feel get bigger versus if I have it panned hard left again. It kind of feels washy, and we can hear that the volume seems to have changed even though I didn't touch a volume, I just touched the pan. We'll go back to that chorus so you can hear it again. So to the right a bit. And that's why I think it's so important to really listen to your overheads. Here's a trick. This is actually a really good trick. Okay, so let's listen to our toms next. Let's find that rack tom, that. So we can hear how the rack tom, whenever it's getting hit, it sounds like it's just a little bit to the left in my headphones, right? So we're going to try to place that just a little bit to the left. And you can always double check yourself with this. Put it into mono. So now we're listening to the drums in mono. And what you do is you flip the phase on the drum track that you're trying to place. So it's going to be saying the exact opposite. So if it was saying push speaker out, it will now be saying suck speaker in. So you just flip the phase on it. And what we're doing is we're listening for when that drum gets the weakest, because where there's the most phase cancellation means that that's the most, when I unflip the phase, that means it's going to be the most in phase. So I flip it's kind of weird to think, but let me show you. So we flip the phase on the track and listen to it now. Now if I you hear how it got louder all of a sudden? So that means it was out of phase. We flip it back, and now we're listening for it to get loudest. And you hear how it's never getting that loud. So maybe on this drum, we might want to have the phase flipped. So let's have the phase flipped and listen to it again. And you hear how it sounds louder now? So let's take it out of mono. So put it back into stereo. And then I'll take that phase flip off. You hear how it's not ringing as well? So what that means is the microphone over the tom is out of phase with the overheads when that tom hits. So the microphone for the tom mic is going push out, suck in, and the overhead mics are going like this, and they're doing the opposite. And since they're doing the opposite, the speaker doesn't get as much signal to being told what to do when the tom hits. Versus when we flip the phase, it makes it so those microphones are working together, so the speaker knows exactly what to do. So this is the most important part of drum miking and mixing drums, is making your drums as in phase as possible. So let's listen to that again with it flipped. That's a nice ringing drum sound to me, so I'm going to leave that phase flip on. And it seems to be pretty good there, so we'll match the panning for the bottom mic. So where did we pan it? 10.4. And, I'm not being super precise right now. So now, the interesting thing with the bottom mic, if you think of the drum, you've got a microphone here and a microphone here. The drum gets hit, so this skin of the drum goes down. That means the bottom skin is going to push out, so it's going like this with the drum itself. Now, that means the microphones are naturally out of phase. So when this is pushing out, it's going to make this mic diaphragm underneath suck in. Well, this one's sucking in. So they're naturally out of phase because there's a little bit of delay. So you always want to start with your top and bottom mic phase flopped to each other. So since we have the rack tom top, we found that it sounded more in phase with the overheads when its phase was flip. I know I'm saying phase a lot. That means the bottom mic we want to have not phase flipped, because we want to keep those out. The top and bottom mic, we have to flip the polarity on those. Almost always you have to do it. Now every once in a while the person tracking the drums will flip the phase for you on the preamp. So you always want to check this. Is the track out of phase already? Did they already adjust that for you? So you just have to check, are the top and bottom mics properly phase aligned or not? And you can listen to it. So that's with it not flipped. Now we put it in. You hear how much louder it was when I flipped the phase? That means when I track the drums in this case, I already flipped the phase on that mic preamp. So we have to set it the same here so that those two tracks are in phase. And we can verify that by going into the edit window and looking at it. And you can see this is the rack tom right here. And you can see how these two tracks are really in phase. When we mic'd up these drums, we made sure they were in phase. And you can see how that signal is going up at the same time and down at the same time. You can just clearly see it. And then we can also clearly see, this is another fun thing, we can verify what our ears told us, which is when this track is going up, this track is going down. And for both overheads, you can see the overheads down here. So when this track is going down, right here, you can see it's the bottom part of the rack tom close mics on both tracks. The overhead mic is going up. So you can see that this rack tom is out of phase with this overhead, almost perfectly. So it's a good thing we checked that and we saw that, oh, this is more in phase when we flipped that channel. So you can always zoom in and double check for yourself. But let's go back to mixing. So we want both of these flipped. And we can hear how that's a nice ringing sound now. And it seems to be panned okay. So let's find the floor tom. We'll go to the chorus. Here's the floor tom part. Actually, let's find. Yeah, so that dun dun da da da. So let's listen in the overheads. And you hear how that sounds like it's coming out of the left. So we're going to do our panning pretty far to the left, and let's listen to it again. That sounds pretty close to me. Unsolo it. Okay, that sounds pretty close. And then let's flip the phase just to check. Yeah. It seemed. We'll go. Let's listen again. Yeah, it seems bigger to me when we don't have the phase flip, so I'm going to go with that. We'll match our panning for the bottom mic. 58, 58. And then let's check these together. Seems like I tracked it with the phase flipped on the bottom mic properly. So we don't have to worry about that right now. We can zoom in and confirm that on a floor tom hit. Let's find a good floor tom hit. So these hits. It's always good to confirm this kind of thing because it makes mixing drums a lot harder if they're out of phase. So you can see how when this top mic is up, the bottom mic's up. There's a little bit of a difference, but it's closer to in phase than out of phase. So we're going to leave that not switched. So and this is an important part. Listen to our drums now that we've just done those adjustments. So just panning, phase, and a little bit of trim volume. Listen to the drums now. You hear how it feels punchier and bigger already? Honestly, volume, panning, and phase, if you get those right, you're way ahead of the curve on everything else, and you don't have to worry about a bunch of EQ things and stuff. There's so many classic records where they did minimal EQing and compression on the drums just because they spent their time miking up the drums properly, and then they spent their time getting the volume and the phase and the panning right. Okay, so next thing, we will save this, and that's the other thing. Get as soon as you're happy with anything or any decision you made, hit Command S. I don't care if your computer has an autosave function. The worst feeling ever is a power outage right in the middle of working, right before an auto backup happened, or the computer freezes up. If you don't trigger finger that Command S, it's going to happen to you, and it will be really annoying. And with audio, it's detrimental because the more you listen to something, the harder it is to be objective. So it's hard to get back to that first time going through it objective take. So you always just want to be hitting Command S when you're working. Let's listen to this end section where the drummer, Charlie was doing a lot of double kick stuff. What I'm watching for here is, am I clipping? Am I going too loud? Yep, not hitting. But it sounds like I need more tick on the kick drum. I'm not going for full ticky click drum like you hear on some metal records. I want it to be more of a thud kick drum for this drum set, but I do want more of that initial attack. So I'm going to turn up the trim on the inside kick mic. So let's solo that so you can hear what I'm talking about. Hear how that has the tick versus the front of kick. So this is a microphone outside of the kick drum, away about a foot. It's got more of the thud, so I want more of the tick. That's why I turn that trim up more. Okay, this is a pretty decent starting balance. Oh, and why I didn't go through the kick and the snare for panning. 9 times out of 10 for rock mixing, you want your kick and your snare drum dead center, even if the overheads tell you to be a little different. The most important thing while you're setting up your overheads is to try to get it so your kick and your snare are as dead center as you can. And when you're mixing, then you have it dead center. And the reason you want that is you want both speakers hitting the kick and the snare because those drive the groove in most rock songs. Obviously, there's some exceptions, but 9 times out of 10, you're going to want dead center kick and snare. First thing we're going to do is we're going to set up what's called a back bus or parallel compression. And so the idea with this is we're sending the drums that we want to sound beefier, so things like the kick, the snare, the toms, to a separate bus, and on that bus we're going to compress the snot out of them. So we're just going to compress it really bad, and then we're going to EQ it so you get some of that low-end ring and some of the attack, but not as much of the mud. And the idea is to kind of bring out the beef of the drums. I'll show you what I mean by that. So in mix bus, this is super easy to set up. We're going to set up as our bus is already set up here in mix bus 1, and we're going to label it, because I love labeling things, and we're going to label this back bus. And you'll also hear people call this parallel compression, New York style compression, but the basic idea is you have a separate bus that has the compressor on it, you send things to it, but it works in parallel. So we're going to send our kick and our snare mic and our rack toms to it. So I'm not sending the overheads and the hi-hats. I'm soloing the bus so you can hear what's being sent to it. And you hear how overheads come through still anyways. It's just going to happen because obviously mics are going to pick up everything around them. Most of those cymbals and stuff are coming through this Barnet kick mic. So let me just solo it so you can hear it. So I'm going to not have it go to the back bus right now, and then we'll bring it in a little bit later. But without that kick mic, you hear how there's less cymbal bleed into these mics. So we want less cymbal bleed into these mics. And what we do on this is we're going to compress the snot out of it. And I'm going to set up a ratio of 10:1. So you can see the gain reduction right here. That's the gain reduction, and then we set the threshold with this. So you can see that compressor's really working. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to boost. See, the EQ here on this bus isn't the greatest for this. So I'm going to add an EQ plugin, and we'll just add our Kirchhoff that we've been using in other parts of this course. What I want to do is basically add a low bump somewhere between 60 and 140, something to kind of emphasize that low punch sound. And then I'm going to add a high bump somewhere between 2K and 7K to kind of add the attack, the clickiness to those drums. And then we're going to cut out the mud region of the drums, whatever it is for that drum set. So let's listen to it. I'll just do a basic cut and add like this just to start out. But obviously we want to listen to it, make sure we're not doing something super detrimental. You hear around for this drum set, the kick and the snare seem to be a little beefier around that 120. So for this one, I'll just leave it there. But you got to listen to it again. And you can actually see it on the waveform here. If I do it super low, I don't feel it as much. But here I really feel it. And then I'm cutting out this like 300 hertz region. Let's go to where the groove was. Let's go verse 1. If I'm here, it kind of makes the snare drum sound weak. If I'm here, it kind of takes that ringing out of the kick drum and makes it a little tighter. So I'm going to take this out of this compressed parallel bus channel, because that seems to be where it is. So with it in, it sounds like this. I'll bypass that, so let that mud back in. You hear how it took a little bit of the tom away, but it also tightened up the kick drum. So I want to keep that there. And then for the high boost, let's kind of sweep that around. You hear how like at this 3 region, I got more tick in the kick drum. The snare seemed a little bit more of an attack. So we're going to leave it there. If I bypass it, here's what it sounds like. Cool. Now we unsolo the back bus. We turn the fader down all the way. And just bring it up slowly. And when you get a little bit more meat, but it doesn't sound super compressed, that's what you're looking for. So if I turn it up all the way like this, it feels a little too compressed. And if I have it down all the way, I'm missing that meat. So I'm looking for an in-between. So for this, I like this like 8 dB down, you know, so let's mute it and A-B really quick. Here's it out. In. Out. In. And you hear how it just made everything punchier, but the rack tom got brought up a bunch. So I'm actually going to turn down the send level on this rack tom so it's not quite as big. So we just turn down that send level. Oh, that sounds nice. Yeah, we'll turn down the rack tom a little more on the sending to the parallel bus, but listen to this chorus without it. So mute that. You hear how it just made it bigger? And we're gonna actually turn down this rack tom in general. I'm gonna just bring it down some more. It's just loud. And I'm going to bring up the floor tom because it's kind of quiet. So mute that back bus some more. Bring it in. Out. In. It feels more like a rock drum kit. And you can go way more on this. You can add more saturation. Sometimes people will add a little bit of distortion on this because they just want more of that meat sound, and that's a cool sound, and you can do all sorts of things. I'm just showing bare bones. So we got our back bus set up. Next thing we're going to do is listen to the snare mic. You can hear how the snare is kind of, it's a very dry sounding snare. It's a small room that we track these drums in. There wasn't a big 80s reverb snare sound. But I don't want to go full 80s on this, but I do want a little bit more room sound, but just on the snare. So what I'm going to do is we're going to set up our second send, and we're going to have it be snare rev, right? So this is just snare rev, and we're going to just send our snare top to it. So here's what snare top sounds like. Right? And we're going to just send the snare top to it, to our snare rev. So we just get this in. And what I'm going to do here is the first thing is I only want the snare itself to activate the reverb. I don't want anything else. So I'm going to put in a gate. And there's lots of different gates. I'm just going to use this one because it's what I'm used to. I like gates with look ahead. So a gate keeps the audio closed until it gets loud enough to be told to open. And with analog gates, sometimes you'll hear the drum hit and then the gate opens just like a hair late because, it has to wait for the drum to hit. One of the advantages of digital is we can look ahead and say, oh, the drum's about to hit, open up the gate for when the drum hits, and then you're good. So that's what the look ahead function. The downside of that is obviously it adds latency. And so in this case, we're adding 10 milliseconds of latency. But it's worth it. We're in mix mode. I don't care if there's extra latency. Not a big deal. So let's set our gate so we're just hearing the snare. And you can hear how the kick drum is still activating the gate. So we're going to use a sidechain EQ. So what I did there is the sidechain that opens the gate is being told only to open. I'm filtering out all the low end. So it can't hear, the gate can't hear the kick drum anymore. It can only hear things above 500 hertz. Versus if I have it down here, you hear how it triggers on those kick drum hits. So then we're going to boost 1K just to make sure we're really getting those snare hits. And I'm actually okay with a little bit of that on those down beats, it kind of coming through a bit, and I'll show you why. Even though that's not all snare drum hits, this is fun. This is a fun trick. So what I'm adjusting now is the release, because you can hear how it's just chopping off the end of the snare drum. So I'm just making it so that it keeps the gate open a little bit longer, so the snare drum doesn't sound so unnatural. So with a fast release, first a little bit slower. That sounds good enough. A hold, it means I have my attack set, and then I'm going to hold open for a certain amount of time, and then the release circuit engages. So on gates, a hold is just saying, hold it open for this amount of time. For this snare drum, it's keeping open enough for what I want it to be doing. And then again, here's without the gate. So this is everything that's actually going there. It's important to have this pre-fader. So not every DAW does this, but in Harrison, you can easily go pre or post fader. So we want this pre-fader. And then we want to add reverb. I like the sound of 480 reverbs on snare drums. It is a Chris Lord-Alge thing. And by the way, if you don't know who he is, check out his mixing. It's unbelievably good. Amazing mixer. But so let's just hear with a 480 emulation plate and then just the snare plate preset. So listen to this. Cool. So we have reverb on just the snare. And I'm going to take some of the mids down a little bit on that. So no mids. All mids. Just taking those down a little bit, and I'm going to add in some of the high sizzle. Maybe that's a little too much. Anyways, we're going to have that pre-fader too. Usually you want reverbs post-fader, but in this case we want it pre-fader. And then I'm going to bring down my fader and just slowly add in that reverb on the snare. And let's listen to it. So here's without. You hear how it just adds a little bit of body to it, and making sure there's no pre-delay or anything on there. Let's listen to that reverb with the snare. So we can hear, I'm going to just solo the snare so we can hear the snare and the reverb. Here's with way too much. Here's with none. And just a little, you can hear how it adds some space to the reverb, but it's still not quite right. So I'm going to bring it up so it's easy to hear. You hear how the decay is just a little too long for this tight of a groove. So it takes a little too long for that snare to die. So I'm going to turn this decay down. You hear how it's a lot tighter now? Here's with it way too long. You can hear how that tail just keeps going and it just is creating a wash. So we just want a tight snare drum for this style is what I'm going for. And this gets into the artistic part of it. But right now I just want a tight room. So I'm going to keep a shorter decay. And then for this, since I want it to feel a little bigger than life, I'm going to turn the width up on the reverb. Yeah, we'll do 2. And then we can hear how and I'm going to turn down the low. There. So I adjust this EQ a little bit. Now we'll bring it in context. And usually what I do with reverbs like this is I bring it in till I can hear it and then I back it down a bit, because remember, once we do mastering, compression and all that stuff, reverb comes up a bit when you do the final mastering compression. So all your reverbs come up a hair. So my rule of thumb is bring in the reverb so you can barely hear it, then back off, and so you can more feel it. And that's what you're looking for. So for me right now, it seems okay at like -8, -9. So I'll mute it now. Unmute. And you can feel how it just adds a little bit more space. So cool. That was way too much on snare reverb. One of the fun things to do, if you listen to any 80s mix, a lot of the times they do something called gated reverb. So they'll add another gate after the reverb and they'll cut off the tail of the reverb. So it's just like this big room sound and then it's dead. That's really fun to play with too. For these drums, I don't want to go there, but that's a fun trick, especially if you want that bigger, larger than life sound. So let's go to chorus 2 and just listen to it for a second. So I still want a little more bite in the snare drum. Notice we haven't actually touched an EQ yet on the whole drum kit. Besides these back bus and the snare reverb, we haven't touched an EQ yet. The rest, it's just been phase, panning, volume on the regular set. And I think that's important to keep in mind. If you really spend a lot of time setting up your mics properly, you don't have to rely on so much post-processing, and it turns into more artistic what are you looking for instead of trying to fix problems. But on this snare drum, you know, I want to start EQing. So you can hear how the snare drum just doesn't have that bite that you normally want out of a snare drum. So we're going to add in the bite section for snare drums is usually somewhere around 1K to 3K. Somewhere in there, you're going to have that initial attack. We're going to add in some 2K and see what happens. So we'll go back to our good old verse 1. So with none, way too much. And you hear how it makes the reverb come out more because we're adding more bite, so it activates the reverb more. So let's turn this reverb down a bit. Okay, and I want even more bite a little bit to that snare. So I'm going to add in, changing this high thing to a bell. This is just a Harrison thing. So the high EQ is automatically set to shelf, but I want it to a bell right now. And I'm going to just add in some more. We'll start with 3K and just see what happens. Turn this down a little more for the reverb. Take that EQ in and out. With the EQ. Without. With. So you can hear how it's just got a little bit of that more high-end snap to it. And that's what I'm looking for. So just a little bit more snap. There's a little bit of the body missing for me in the snare too. So let's listen to it. So right now I'm changing this low to a bell again. So it's just a bell. And we're going to sweep around and look for some more body. So I'll turn this up way too loud. And we're going to find the thud of the snare drum. So without the EQ. Without EQ. With. And I'll do that soloed so you can hear it soloed. I usually like to EQ, by the way, in context, unless there's a problem and I'm looking for a problem. But only go looking for problems if you can hear it in context, because if you go looking for problems, you're always going to find them. Anyway, so we were EQing in context to listen with the rest of the kit, but I'll just solo it so you can hear with and without. So soloed. No EQ. You hear how it added some more high-end bite, low-end punch. But what's also happening, and this is interesting, you hear how the hi-hat sounds kind of phasey now? So I'm actually going to use the low-pass filter to take some of that high end out. So I'm going to just set it at 16K. No low pass filter. 16K. And if we go down too much, it muffles it out. So I'm just getting some of that phasiness out from the hi-hat. And then I'm making the high pass filter so I don't get the low end thud from the kick drum, but I don't want to affect my snare drum sound at all. Now if I put those filters in and out, check this out. No filtering. Hear how it kind of cleaned it up? So I'm just taking out the very, very top with the hi-hat bleed in and the very, very low with the kick drum bleed, and it just tightens up the snare just a hair. And then I'm going to bring up this trim a little more because the snare wants to be a little louder. Now let's listen to this kick drum. So we're going to go to a place where the kick drum's really going, so the end section. So I'm going to just solo the kick inside mic so you can hear what I'm talking about. So this is where we're looking for the kick click a lot and then the low end oomph, but we don't want the middle. And this kick drum mic, if I remember right, it was a Shure kick drum mic. Yeah, it was the Shure one, the standard Shure kick mic. And it already scoops out a lot of the mid-range, but we might want to emphasize that some more. And I want a little bit more of the click. So in context, we're looking for the click of that kick drum mic. So we're gonna just boost, and we're gonna start at, it sounds like it's somewhere to 3K to me. So it's somewhere 3.3K, somewhere around there. And then I'll back off this volume boost. And you notice I turned it up by 14 dB. That's way too loud. I'm just listening for where that click sounded good in context, and then I'll back it off. So in context. And you can hear how it's just like a little bit more of that click, but there's a lot of meat to that kick drum, and it's in that like low mids region, so in the somewhere in the 200s. So I'm going to just turn down 200 just a hair by a dB and listen to it now. Take it all the way out. You hear how it got a little hollow, but it sounds cleaner. Bring it back in slowly. You hear how like taking out 2 dB at 200 just cleaned it up. So without that EQ in, we'll do the AB with the EQ. So yeah, it's just taking some of that mud away, adding a little bit of click, but we want a little bit of body. I'm saying a little bit a lot. We want some more body. So let's find some of the body. So I'm changing this to a bell again, and we'll start at 40 Hertz to go way down and look for that body. Oh, you hear at 60 how it just started coming in. So we're gonna go back and just add a little bit. You hear when I'm popping it in how it suddenly just pops out of the speaker a little more. Without, with. Isn't that kind of cool? So no, we've still not used any compression on the individual drums. We're just doing compression on the back bus. You would be amazed at how often some of the biggest sounding rock records, they really didn't rely on too much compression on the individual tracks. It was more just like overall drum bus or overall back bus, that parallel compression. There wasn't as much on the individual drum tracks. Obviously, there's plenty of great rock records that they compress all the individual drum tracks all over the place, and that's a sound, and there's nothing wrong with that sound. But I think a lot of people tend to go for that sound first because they think that's what they're supposed to do. They are afraid to just let the drummers be more dynamic. Now, this goes into how good of a drummer you are too, because if you have a really good drummer like Charlie, he's a very consistent hitter, so I don't need to add compression to make him more consistent. He's very consistent on his own, and that's partially why I can get away with this. And that's the joy of working with really talented musicians, is as a mix engineer, you can be more artistic and you're not looking to fix problems as much. I noticed on the end section here, we're starting to hit this limiter. Now, usually in a full mix, I would have this all routed to its own bus. So I'm going to show you how I do that. So I set up a bus, and I usually set it up as 9. So this is going to be my drum bus. And I'm going to make it so on all of these tracks, they don't go onto the master. So they're not going to master anymore. So if I play, I'm only getting, these aren't going to master either. So I get nothing because nothing's being sent to the master. So what I'm going to do now is send everything to the drum bus. That's a drum. And then I'm going to send these back, the parallel bus and the snare rev, to the drums bus. So that way, everything is on this one fader for the drums. And the reason it's good to do this, and you can do this in any DAW, it's just, this is how you do it in Mixbus. The idea is you want all of your drums with the reverbs on the drums and any delays or anything like that going to one fader. And the reason is because then it's easy to say, oh, the drums are too loud, turn them down, or the drums aren't loud enough, turn them up. When you're at that final part of a mix, it makes your life so much easier to have all the things routed. So it's, hey, this fader is my drums, this fader is my guitars, this fader is my vocals. And you will save so much time if you set your sessions up that way. So what I'm going to do here is on this end section, it's hitting that limiter, and I don't want it to hit that limiter. So I'm going to just turn down this fader, or I could turn down the trim here and just have it so my trim is a little bit lower. Now I don't hit that fader, I'm still rocking 0 on everything. And I have plenty of headroom. I'm not hitting my limiter. I've got plenty of headroom to add all the other instruments. And I know that when I start adding in other instruments, I've got a decent starting point for automation at 0 on my faders. And that's how I like to approach this kind of stuff. So on our drum bus, if we want to add a little bit of EQ or compression, we can. So we can start mixing into a compressor here. So we turn down our trim. Let's give ourselves a little more headroom. So down 6 dB. And we're going to add in a compressor. So we're going to add in an SSL style compressor. So this is, the SSL is a famous mixing console, in case you don't know. And there's a bus compressor on it that is the sound of like rock glue from the mid 80s moving on. It's just a famous sounding compressor, and it has this weird grab and release thing where it just makes it sound like a rock record really quick. But I like this one, the Townhouse version. This is a model Brainworks did. It's basically an SSL style compressor with a transformer in it, so it's got a little more harmonics in it. But let's set this up. And what I usually set it for as a starting place is a 4-to-1 ratio, slowest attack, fastest release, and we just set our threshold so we're just getting a hair of movement, maybe even zero movement. We just want a little bit. So bringing down the threshold. So you see how the needle's barely moving? That's probably even a little bit too much movement on the needle for me for this. But let's listen to it without, and then I'll pop it in and you'll hear what it does. Without. You hear how it just brought the whole drum set together and made it feel cohesive? And the idea is we're just adding a hair of compression. And you can see how the needle's not even moving, really, but it's still, we hear a huge difference. So it's actually compressing a little too much for me, so I'll back it down on the threshold a little more. So without, without, and then let's listen to that end where the drummer's really going again. Without, with, and then obviously we got the makeup gain in there, so let me turn that down so you can A-B it a little better. If you're not used to you're naturally going to think anything louder is better. So always watch your makeup gain when you're doing this A-B. I'm just used to the sound of this. But anyway, so I'll turn the makeup gain down. So out, in. You hear how it brings everything a little more forward and a little more in your face. So without, in. Now I'm going to bring the makeup gain back in, because with this compressor, as I said, it's modeling going into a transformer, add some harmonics, and I like it. So I'm just bringing in a bit of makeup gain. But it just makes it a little tighter drum sound. Isn't that cool? So if we go back to our verse 1, here's what the drums sound like now, going into that compressor with our parallel, with a very little bit of EQ. We'll bypass that compressor again. Isn't that cool? Honestly, I'd start mixing in the rest of the album now. I usually don't like spending this long setting up a drum mix because I want to hear what the song is going to tell me to do with it. We're just kind of digging into some of the techniques, but you can hear how we didn't have to dig in too much with EQs. We didn't have to dig in a bunch with individual compression settings. Once we got that bus compressor set up, and once we got the parallel compressor set up, it started sounding like a rock drum sound pretty quick. So the next thing I would do is I would bring in the other instruments and I'd start listening to the whole song and not worry so much about my drum sound, and then fix things as they came around as I'm mixing. But just for demonstration purposes, we'll keep working on solo drums, just so we can really dig into different techniques and thoughts. So here's chorus 2. Let's listen to this for a second. So that hi-hat is a little splashy and it's coming through a little too much, but I like the volume in the chorus 1 where it is. I like it there, but you hear in chorus 2 it's a little splashy. That wow. So I'm gonna actually just take out some of the low end of it and just go in and take out some of the low end. I don't need a bunch of low end in my hi-hat sound. So we'll just set our high pass filter to 200, see what it sounds like now. Hear how that tightened it up? Maybe that was a little too much. 180. Yeah, and then let's add a little bit of 6K to that, so it's a little bit crunchier. And this I am going to do with the high shelf, so it's just bringing up everything at, well, it's just going to bring everything up from 5K up. So let's listen to it now. Okay, so it's not quite as splashy, but it's got a little more sizzle. Let's listen to chorus 1. So if we bring up that high end even more, it's giving me that holding the beat. Now it's too loud because we brought up so much high end, so we're going to bring down the input trim. So that's one of the disadvantages of mixing with a mouse, is usually when you're EQing something, if you're boosting with the EQ, it's going to bring up the volume, so you want to lower at the same time. So if you're mixing analog or you have some sort of control surface that lets you do two things at once, it makes life a lot easier. But versus a mouse, I can't adjust the EQ and the volume at the same time. And for me, that's one of the big disadvantages of a mouse. But as long as you are aware of it, of, hey, if I boost a bunch with my EQ, I'm going to need to lower the volume, then you're okay. But just keep it in mind, because the first thing you do when you're on a board is you do both at the same time. So we just brought out some more sizzle in that hi-hat. We took out some of the low end, and actually, I'm going to bring out a little, I'm going to take this down to 4.5K, and then we'll boost a little bit more. Bring the trim back down. And you hear how having that hi-hat there with the low toms, it's making the toms sound a little lower because there's more high end going up. Isn't that weird? So we'll take the EQ out and just listen, instead of listening to the hi-hat, listen to the toms. This is a weird thing that happens psychoacoustically. So no EQ. Now I'm bringing in the EQ. Listen to the toms. None. You hear how the toms almost sound fuller? I didn't touch the toms, I'm touching the hi-hat mic. And this is one of the big important things about mixing. Your ears hear everything in context. So if there's more high end in the hi-hat, it makes the lows sound lower because there's a bigger range between the two. If there's less high end up here, it's going to sound duller, and so everything's going to sound lower. But as soon as our ears hear that contrast, it feels bigger to us. The contrast adds the depth. Think of it like when you're looking at a picture, like if you take a picture and you add contrast, it's going to make the shadows darker and the highlights higher, and it feels like there's more there, because our brains like that contrast. So the same thing happens with audio. If you hear more high end, the lows sound lower, and if you hear more low end, the highs sound higher. So you want to find that balance where, okay, I'm not overdoing it, but I'm emphasizing the highs a little bit and emphasizing the lows a little bit, and suddenly that contrast makes everything sound bigger. So listen again. I'm going to have this EQ out and I'll pop it in, and just listen to the toms, not the hi-hat. Isn't that fun? So that's also why it's important to EQ in context, because any change you make to any part is going to change the feel of the other parts. So again, we're doing that in context so we kind of understand the change to the feel. Let's listen to those low toms and kind of add some low end bump to the floor tom a bit. And I'm actually going to do it to the bottom mic. And the first thing I'm going to do is filter out the low lows because it seems like it's a little loose. So I'm just taking out my high pass filter and setting it at 30. So we got some of that low taken out. But let's boost, we'll put it into bell mode. And then we're going to go down to 40 and just sweep up. No EQ with the EQ. You hear how that low thud came out a bit? So now, obviously, we brought up our EQ, so we got to bring down the trim. And then the top mic, the initial attack in the top mic, so here's what it's soloed. I want a little bit more of that attack, so we're going to start with around 2K, and we'll just boost by 4 dB so we can really hear it. Okay, it seems like 2.8, and then I'm going to back this off a hair. No kick. And it's a little loose sounding on that floor tom still, so I'm going to actually take out some of the low lows with the high pass filter again. So here's soloed so you can hear what's going on. Floor tom bottom. So I'm looking for that oomph from this, right? I take my EQ out. Doesn't have as much of that oomph. Put it in. Out. In. And then with the floor tom top, we'll take it out. In. You hear how that initial stick hit, it's coming out a little more? That's what we were looking for. So solo them together. Isn't that nice? And I actually might even bring up that whole thing a little bit. So we'll bring up 3.5 dB. We'll bring it up there. And then the low lows of that are a little much for me still. So I'm going to bring up my high pass filter just a hair. And the important thing, again, in context, my overhead mics are picking up. Here's the solo overhead mic so you can hear. They're picking up a lot of that rack tom, not as much as the floor tom. So that's why the rack tom feels so much bigger. And I'm getting a lot of the boom from the rack tom, but not as much thud from the floor tom. That's something to be aware of. How does it sound in the overheads? And sometimes I like to keep overheads natural-ish sounding, even for a record like this. But a lot of the times you're going to end up going in and EQing your overheads too. The real trick, if you are going to EQ your overheads, is make sure you're doing the same EQ on the left and right so you keep your stereo image sounding uniform. Because if it's a lot different sounding in the right channel than the left channel, it starts to sound a little wonky. And sometimes artistically that's really fun. But if you're trying to be engineering about it, you want to keep it uniform EQ curves on your overheads. And that's why you get matching mics for overheads a lot of the times. But, you know, artistic, have fun with it. Some of my favorite drum sounds are totally different in the left side than the right side, and you can have fun. On these overheads, we can hear that rack tom is just really coming out, that like mid-range thud. So I'm going to go in, and to me it sounds like we'll just say 400 hertz, right? And this is part of that ear training thing. It's why it's good to always start those ear training exercises. But for me, it's just a little bit of that 400 hertz range. Maybe it's these headphones, but I'm going to just lower by 1 dB at 400 on left and right. And let's listen to it now. You hear how that ring quite isn't as much, so I'll take that EQ out. Put it in. Kind of tightened it up a bit, so we'll do that in context. EQ out. It tightened it up a hair. It's not a big difference, but when you're EQing overheads, you don't want to be doing too much drastic things usually. So the other thing I'm going to do is add a little bit more sizzle to the cymbals. Okay, so we've got a pretty good drum sound going on this. And again, at this point, I definitely would be bringing in other things in the mix and building the song and seeing how I'd want to shape the drums for the song. I don't think it's a good idea to spend too long on individual instruments without getting into context as quickly as possible. A good example was the hi-hat thing with the toms, of having that hi-hat up high changed how the toms are perceived. And the same thing happens with guitars and drums and vocals and drums. Like, everything affects everything when you're mixing. So you want to get to having all the parts in the song as quickly as possible so you can start figuring out the context of what you're trying to do. So let's just listen to these drums a little bit and see if there's anything that sticks out while we're listening to them. And then we'll do an A-B without the processing we've added and with, and call it a day on these. So here's the verse again. I'm kind of feeling like I want a little more, they call it air on the overhead. So when people say air, they usually mean super high end, the past 10K range. I'm going to go up to 14K on a shelving EQ on these overheads. Again, you want to make sure you're doing exactly the same for left and right. And I'm going to just add 1 dB. So we got 1 dB at 14.40, 1 dB at 14.40. So let's listen to it now. Take the EQ out. Out. You can feel how it's just lifting it a hair. Maybe we'll add a little bit more, so we'll do 1.5. Let's find that splash and listen with it out. Okay, listen with that EQ in. Yeah, so it didn't get hurty. So one of the things with overheads, if you're boosting the high end, is you want to make sure you're not accidentally make those cymbals hurt, because that can happen really quick. And keep in mind that when all this hits a mastering compressor, it's going to squish it in and the high end pops out a little bit. So I tend to look for a very open mix that doesn't have a hyped high end, and then it's easy for the mastering engineer to add a little bit more high end if it's needed. But it tends to come out a bit when you master anyway. So it's just a keep in mind kind of thing. Let's check out the second chorus, and I'll do it in context, and we'll pop that EQ in and out on the overheads. Yeah, because that's really splashy, so we'll pop the EQ out. And you can hear how there's a little too much high end, so we're going to back down to 1 dB. And it's amazing how much just half a dB does in something like this, isn't it? Yeah, so just adding a little bit of that air. This gets into that kind of thing where if you haven't spent a bunch of time ear training, it might not be sticking out to you as well. Don't worry about it. This kind of thing you start hearing easier and easier the more you do this. You have to go with your feelings, like, can I feel, this is the more of an EQ adjustment of, can I feel that it's a little bit more open, not can I consciously say, oh yeah, I added, a dB at 14K. It's more of a, oh, it feels a little more open without hurting. That's what I'm looking for. So again, let's just listen to the splashy signal, cymbal. So, and we'll solo the overhead so it's easier to hear. This is with it in, with it out. You hear how those cymbals just come up just a hair, but not too much. Yep. I'm liking the strum sound. The only other thing I could hear is I'd want the snare to stick out a little more, so maybe on this bottom snare mic, we'll push it a hair just to really kind of make it sit. So here's the bottom snare mic. Here's what it sounds like by itself. And you can hear how it actually gets a lot of the kick drum in it. So here's both of the snare mics together. And we can use this bottom mic to give a little bit more of a bite. And let's double check the phase on it, just to make sure. Yeah, you hear how it sounds weird with the phase flop, so I recorded it with the phase flop again. But let's add a little bit more bite to that bottom snare drum. So we're gonna add a little bit of that somewhere in the 2K to 3K range. So we'll start at 2.5K and just add a dB. Well, we'll add more. Let's add a good bit more. And this one is actually up at 4K, so we'll back down so it's not so much, and I'll unsolo it so you can hear it. hear that 4K, how it suddenly opened up a bit? So now we go back to 0 on our gain amount. And then, yeah. Adding 2.5, there it is. In, out. So that end section really shows it. So out, in. You hear how it just comes out. It seems more alive all of a sudden. And I'm actually going to add in a little bit of a filter. Just to get rid of that low end in that mic. And do you hear how that made the kick drum sound a little tighter? Listen to that. Without the filter. With the filter. Isn't that cool? Without. With. And the reason that happens is now we don't have two microphones trying to say what the low end should be doing to the speakers. Since we're taking that low end out of the snare drum, the low end in the kick drum mics are telling the speakers what to do there. So that's why the kick suddenly sounds punchier, is there's just less stuff cluttering it up. And usually, a lot of the times, that's why you'll go through and add a filter on every mic except for the kick drums and, you know, the overheads. It's very situational. Sometimes you want that low end in the overheads. Sometimes you don't want any low end in the overheads. So I'm actually going to do the same thing for the rack tom really quick. Let's find a spot where the rack tom's going. That first chorus, it does it a lot. Just add in some of these. Yeah, it's not hurting the toms there. So the trick is again, you don't want these filters to be hurting the toms, but you want it to be cleaning up the low end a little bit for the kick drum. So listen back to that end section. Let's listen to that fill without those filters in. Put those filters back in. Hear how it just sounds tighter? And so now we actually have some room in this low end. So this front of kick mic, you can hear how there's not much low end here. Most of it's in the inside kick mic, right? So I like when it's in phase and everything's working, I tend to find I can get a lot of that low end energy in the front of kick mic, but it has to be an in phase mic. So let's just add these two together by themselves. And we're going to So what I'm looking for here is the fundamental of the kick drum. So I've got it on a low end bell, so it's just a bell curve, and we're looking for the fundamental. I'm looking for a part where it suddenly just feels punchier. So it's feeling punchy to me there. So we won't do that much of a boost. We'll go back to no boost. That's pretty feeling better without, with, without, with, or you can get a volume with more boost. Without, with. Obviously with these EQs, we don't see a graph. And I actually think that's an advantage because we're using our ears more instead of saying, oh, the fundamentals here. Because remember, those graphs in the EQs don't always tell the truth. They usually are pretty good, but they don't always tell the truth. So let's look at it with a graph on. We've got the equilibrium, and the important thing is the EQ from the Harrison is before, we can see the layout, it's before the equilibrium. So any EQing we're doing here is going to affect what this graph sees. But check this out. So without that Harrison EQ in, we can see how there's a fundamental around that 120 mark, and there's one down at 40, but there's a lot of energy in that 70 to 80. And if I was just looking at this, if I was using a graph EQ, I might boost here and I might boost here, you know, where those bumps already were, and that could work. So let's listen to that. But it sounds kind of like weirdly disconnected versus when I was using my ears with the Harrison, I ended up around 73 hertz and listened to the Harrison. You feel how that's thicker sounding than if I have these two boosts? So I'm doing a boost of, well, let's be fair, and because I did a lot more of a boost with the Harrison. So if we do a dB boost with both of these on those points, and I did 4 dB, so we'll do 2 dB here for each one of these, so it'll be equivalent to a 4 dB boost. And this is the other thing that's dangerous about graphing EQs, is you're less likely to do something like this because it looks funny. If you're using something that doesn't have a graph, you're more likely to just turn the knob until it sounds good. And that's one of the dangers of graphing EQs. So, equilibrium. Now, let's listen to the same thing with the Harrison. Equilibrium. Harrison. Equilibrium. You hear how it sounds a little thicker just having that boost at 70? So let's do that with the equilibrium. We'll do 73 and we'll do a boost of 4 dB. So just like the Harrison. You hear how the Harrison sounds thicker? Harrison, equilibrium. This is an important thing. Neither of these have saturation in them. The Harrison has more analog cues to it, though. It doesn't have a perfect cue like the equilibrium does. So we can actually change this to be closer to the Harrison. It actually has it in here. 32 is the Harrison, and you see how much wider that cue is, and that's why the Harrison sounded different. So now we turn the equilibrium on. Go back to the see, they're the same now. So they're basically the same. I'm sure I could get it closer, but the point is analog modeled cues, even without saturation, usually they're a lot wider than what the digital presets are for, a theoretically perfect cue. And that's one of the reasons people like these analog modeled EQs. Now, this doesn't add saturation like a full modeled one would, where it adds saturation. And I wouldn't want my channel strips to actually add saturation in a DAW. That would actually be too much saturation. So I'm glad they didn't try to model in the saturation into Mixbus. But you see how this looks silly. It kind of looks weird if I'm just looking at this graph layout. I have this huge bump like that. It's this really wide thing. I normally... I like the way it sounds. I like what it's doing on both of them, having that huge bump. But this isn't something, if I was using this EQ, I probably wouldn't have ended up with this. Versus with an EQ where I don't see a graph like this and it's just a knob, it doesn't feel weird to just boost it and go, oh, it sounds good there. Sounded good in context, because in context, it's an even bigger deal. Here's in context with the equilibrium. You hear how it adds so much weight. And this is, again, just something you probably wouldn't do. So a lot of the times, I highly recommend, when you're getting your initial sounds, of not having the analyzers turned off and not using an EQ where you can see a graph like this, and using knobs. And this is why, is because a lot of the times, even on the equilibrium, you can see when I look at the knobs, it's like, okay, it's 4 dB at 73. It's not that big of it, it's just like, okay, 2 knob turns, not a big deal. But on this, it's like, even though I'm looking at this and I'm preaching about it, it feels weird to see that big bump like that. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I've seen a lot of people that are afraid to do what would be a normal EQ curve with these kind of visual EQs just because it looks funny. And I think that's honestly one of the reasons why a lot of the times when people sit down at a desk and they mix with an actual desk where you don't see readouts like that, they're happier with their mix because they're not caring about what it looks like, and they're just listening and they're going, oh, that sounds cool. Done. Rant over on that. Let's turn off the equilibrium and we'll turn back on the Harrison just to keep things straightforward. And we'll do an A-B with all this turned on that we've done, and then with all of it turned off. And through the magic of editing, we'll listen with turned on versus turned off. So here we go. Turned on, starting on the verse. There we go. Have some fun with it.